Thank you very much. Yes, so neither Steve Kelly, who was going to be speaking, nor Paul Downey, who was going to be speaking before him. Just to sort of give you a little bit of insight, Paul Downey, until last week, was the Deputy Director of Homelessness in DC. Suddenly there was another problem in interfaith relations, funnily enough, which he's had to go off and do. And so we have an interim deputy director called Steve Kelly, who's going to step in his place. I know both of them really wanted to be here, but a small crisis has occurred in the department, which Steve has to deal with, and so you're stuck with me. But I have been working in homelessness for the government since about 2008 in homelessness and support. I've been involved in things like the temporary accommodation target, and that was running under the last administration. And working with local authorities, also working with the voluntary sector. I've been responsible for the Fair Chance Fund, which has just launched, or about to launch, which I'm going to talk about a little bit, and setting up the Rough Sleepers Social Impact Fund in London, and basic breakfast reduction and so on. So hopefully we can give you a bit of a perspective across the piece. I'll try and make plenty of time for questions. And I just would like to say at the beginning, how pleased I am that you're doing this kind of event, because the way that you're aiming to get the various sections of the community involved in dealing with deprivation in the area is exactly the sort of thing that we would like to see in terms of a join up, a more holistic approach, and an approach therefore that can perhaps achieve better outcomes and results for people, given the spending constraints that we currently have. So it's great to be here. And I look forward to speaking to you. So what I want to do basically is cover three areas. I want to give you an overview of homelessness and rough sleeping from the government's point of view, and explain the difference. I want to say something about what we're currently doing in terms of our policy response and the programmes that we're undertaking to try and deal with this area. And I want to spend a bit of time at the end just looking forward to the possibilities for the next spending round of the next administration, whatever it is, to what we are thinking in terms of the way forward might be. Of course, that will depend on who gets elected and what their priorities are. Okay. So, just to start with then, we look at homelessness trends. If you look at that graph, what you can see is that homelessness was pretty high, and going up until about 2004, when there was a big program under the last administration to introduce a homelessness prevention agenda, which reduced it very significantly. Now it's been going up a little bit in recent times, but actually in the last year or so, homelessness acceptances are on a downward trend. So the figures are. In London, which actually was going up faster than the rest of the country, they've fallen by 7% compared to the same quarter last year. So that's now about 4,000 people accepted in a quarter as homeless in London, and there's been a 2% decrease nationally. Now you might wonder why that is. You might expect that homelessness acceptance figures would be going up given the constraints that we have and so on, but it seems to be, it's according to statistics, that it's a more stable picture than you might imagine, and part of the reason for that possibly is that we have maintained under the coalition government and actually increased the amount of funding to local authorities specifically on homelessness. So there continues to be a visible amount of money paid to local authorities through the Business Reputation Scheme for homelessness prevention, which is in contrast to some other areas where there's been more pressure on local authorities to cut funding. So I think that's been helpful. One of the things within that trend, though, is that there are some changes in the reasons for homelessness acceptances. So what there's been a rise of is homelessness acceptances as a result of the end of insured short-term tenancy. And we know that in some areas, particularly London and the South East, and I'm sure there's some truth in Luton, it's harder for people on benefits and homeless families to be able to get private rented sector accommodation, and that's one of the issues that we have to address in the context of trying to reduce the overall bill on welfare, which is a big government priority. And also you can see from that stat that who the homeless households are who are accepted, and a big chunk of them are lone parent households. with a smaller number, really, of single homeless people who probably are the people that you're most interested in this particular group in terms of deprivation. But I think there are real issues also for homeless families, particularly in bed and breakfast and temporary accommodation, in terms of what are the long-term outcomes for the children of those families, particularly if they're being moved from pillar to post in different types of accommodation, some of which is not very satisfactory. So whilst I'm going to focus a bit on single homelessness, we're not forgetting that. Okay. So this is looking at temporary accommodation. So temporary accommodation is where a local authority will accept a homelessness duty to a household, and then they won't have social housing to put them into straight away, so they'll put them into temporary accommodation, which typically is private rented sector accommodation leased from a private sector landlord. And again, that dropped very significantly from 2004, and it's been going up more recently, but possibly the trend is slowing because that will tend to lag homelessness acceptances. So at the moment, at the end of the last quarter for which we have results, there are 56,000 families in temporary accommodation across the country. A particular issue for us is bed and breakfast. So it's really bad for families with children to be in bed and breakfast accommodation. There used to be an awful lot of families in bed and breakfast accommodation until it was made illegal to do that for more than 6 weeks over 10 years ago. But there has been a sort of worrying rise over the last few years, but we've focused quite a lot of attention on that. We've allocated some funding to bed and breakfast reduction. There's been quite a lot of pressure on local authorities who are putting families in bed and breakfast not to do so. It's a priority in one of those. But also bed and breakfast costs local authorities money. So it has actually been dropping over the last year or so, and it'd be interesting to see if it continues to do so. And there's also, thankfully, a 24% decrease in the number of households headed by 16 and 17-year-olds in bed and breakfast, which is now a very low number, at least those who are accepted as homeless. So, moving on to rough sleeping then. So most rough sleepers, people who are actually sleeping on the streets, would not be statutory homeless. So the fact that you been sleeping on the streets will not give you sufficient vulnerability under the homelessness legislation to be accepted as a rule, although there are exceptions to that. And again, that's been going up, but going up relatively slowly, and certainly compared to the point when the Rough Sleepers Unit came in with these cases, it's still significantly lower than it was then, but it's obviously too high. So the snapshot of that is that there are 2,414 people considered to be rough sleeping on a single night for the last statistics that we have in England. And if you look at them by age, then biggest chunk are between 26 and 45. The numbers between 18 and 25 are too high, about 10%. But the numbers actually under 18 are very, very low indeed. I think 11 people were seen in London in the last year in London. Just sort of more interesting that actually less than half of the people seen rough sleeping in London last year were UK nationals, 46%. So the rest were from other countries, and 31% from Central and Eastern Europe. And we know if you look in this area, it's harder to get accommodation and help for people from Eastern Europe. 3% of people seen rough sleeping in the year were UK nationals who've been in the armed forces, so that's actually a much lower figure than some people think it is. Although quite a lot of people from other countries' armed forces were seen rough sleeping on the streets, so the overall figure is about 10%, and that's mainly former soldiers from elsewhere. Actually, I will just say one other thing about bed and breakfast figures. Although that figure is still relatively low, the number of families in bed and breakfast over 6 weeks, there are certainly areas of the country, and again particularly London, where the pressures on local authorities to be able to secure a temporary accommodation which is suitable and long-term, at least from the private rented sector, are such that they are having to use a lot of nightly paid accommodation. So it's not actually shared B&B, but it is sometimes self-contained annexes, which are very expensive for the local authority, and and also not always a very good solution for the family. So there is hidden pressure there that you don't see necessarily from those being bigger than that. We're very concerned about trying to do something about it. So, what are you doing about it? Well, £500 million funding over the period of the government to prevent homelessness, which is actually an increase on what's been spent before. In the Localism Act, the law was changed to allow a local authority to end the homelessness duty in the private rented sector. So that is aimed to give more flexibility to local authorities to be able to help homeless families in a different way without necessarily increasing the pressure on social housing. We have something called the Gold Standard, which came out of the Making Every Contact Count report from the Homelessness Ministerial Working Group. There's a cross-governmental ministerial working group that looks at homelessness to see, well, what are the contributions that other departments can make other than DCLG to do something about homelessness. So it has representation from Ministry of Justice, DWP, the Home Office, Ministry of Defence, and so on. And increasingly, we're looking to see if we can join up our approach to achieve better outcomes for people who might become homeless, but also have a range of other problems that would be of interest to those departments. Department of Health is a key example where people will be in hospital to move to when they come out of hospital, and what do you do about that? It needs the activities of more than one department to try and solve problems like that. We have the Gold Standard, which is not a DCLG run thing, but it's being run by the National Practitioner Support Service that we fund, and that's trying to improve practice amongst local authorities in dealing with homelessness. So in order to achieve the Gold Standard, which nobody has actually done yet, you have to have 10 policies in place that that's had. So for example, no families in bed and breakfast in 6 weeks. You have to have a pathway for each group of homeless people. For example, young people or people living in prison or whatever, there needs to be a pathway to get them into accommodation and sort them out. So there's a number of things. There's also the National Homelessness Advice Service that we fund, which is trying to provide support to the front line. That's it's run jointly by Shelter and Citizens Advice Bureau, and they offer training and support to the voluntary sector and to local authorities to strengthen capacity and knowledge. And bed and breakfast, as I say, this is a ministerial priority, and we have got the numbers down, although we're concerned that they stay down and don't start to increase again. Okay, so if we look at rough sleeping specifically, what have we got going on? So one new initiative is StreetLink. I don't know how many people know about StreetLink. Yeah. So a reasonable smattering, but a lot of people don't. So this is an attempt to involve members of the public in dealing with rough sleeping. And basically you can get an app for your mobile phone or the website or the phone line, so that if you see somebody sleeping on the streets in your area, you can phone this line, which operates nationally, run by Homeless-Link on Broadway, and they will make a referral of that person to the local authority with responsibility for dealing with rough sleeping in that area. So, so you actually have a route as a member of the public to express your concern about somebody who's sleeping on the streets and to get the local authority in that area to know about it. And by the end of August 2014, there'd actually been 18,400 referrals of rough sleepers to local authorities, via members of the public through that. And 41% of those had a positive outcome, such as accessing services or a housing action. There's also No Second Night Out. Now that started in London, and the idea of that is that if you are rough sleeping on the streets and you stay there for any length of time, that is likely to increase the other problems that you would have. For example, you're more likely to drink, you're more likely to take drugs. It's likely to have a negative effect on your physical and mental health. And so people can become entrenched on the streets if they stay there for a while. It can be harder for them to come off. So the idea of No Second Night Out is that the first time somebody is seen rough sleeping on the streets by an outreach team, they are taken and offered a service. Now in London it's a hub, so basically it's a place where you go and they don't actually give you somewhere to sleep. You can go sit in a chair and access services, and they will try immediately to reconnect you to the place that you came from and find accommodation of some kind for you there, whether that's liaison with the local authority or provision of temporary accommodation, but something just to get you off the street so that you don't get involved in that lifestyle. And that's been rolled out over the country over the last year or two. So 2,546 rough sleepers were helped over a 6-month period in 20 no second night areas outside London. And that's quite successful. It's helped 67% of those rough sleepers off the street after a single night, and 78% did not return to the street. So we're pleased with no second night out. And it's good that it's an operation across Bedfordshire, and of course NOAA's role in getting that to happen. So we have the Crisis PRS Access Scheme. Now the idea of that is how can we get more private rented sector accommodation for single homeless people, and we funded Crisis to support PRS access schemes across the country. They've funded a lot of them. It's actually created over 8,000 tenancies for single homeless people from 2010 and to date. So that's gone pretty well, although it is harder in some areas than others. It's harder to get PRS access into work in London where there's not so much PRS than it is in some other areas where there is. We're doing something called Strive, which is a joint pilot with DWP and BIS, which is trying to see if we can increase access to skills and employment for former rough sleepers in homeless hostels. There can be barriers in the way the skills funding system operates, which make it very hard for people to get access to the things that might actually lead them into education and training and towards employment. The idea of this is to see, well, if we break down some of those barriers and we give them a little bit of funding, can we do more to actually assist? If it's successful, then we may be able to do something to roll that out and increase some flexibility to work with homeless people in that way. So it'll be interesting to see how that turns out. The Fair Chance Fund is something that I've been involved in, and that's a new £15 million payment by results scheme, which we're doing jointly with the Cabinet Office. And we've basically decided which bids we want to fund and do diligence on them at the moment, so I can't name them. But the idea there is that there's a group of young people, 18 to 24, who don't fit into the priority need under the homelessness legislation, because you have to be pretty vulnerable to get priority need under the homelessness legislation. But are too difficult to work with and chaotic to actually be given accommodation and supported housing. So it's aimed at a relatively small number of young people who actually are too hard to help. So they won't get into supported housing because they won't engage with the services, or because they've had rent arrears and been evicted umpteen times before. And it can sometimes be that the people with the worst, most chaotic problems actually get no service at all. And we think that those are the people who are likely to go on to be prolific offenders, long-term rough sleepers and so on. And so we think payment by results, where we're paying for long-term accommodation sustainment outcomes for those homeless young people, and also getting them to education, training and employment, allows sufficient flexibility for voluntary sector providers to work with people in a bespoke way, over a 3-year period, across, in and out, whatever services they might access, to actually try and turn their lives around. And if you could turn their lives around, then probably, apart from it being a good thing to do, to save the state a lot of money, because of the future criminal justice costs and so on that might be incurred. So it's a good thing to do morally and ethically, but it also is a financial reason why you want to do it. Now I know there's been some discussion already this morning about payment by results and outcomes and so on. And what we're trying to do with this is to say, well, it's hard to measure some of those softer outcomes, although we are paying voluntary sector providers to do outcome start-type assessments with people, even though we're not measuring on progress on outcome start-type assessments, but we are funding that. What we hope is that by funding long-term accommodation sustainment outcomes, that is encouraging the voluntary sector organisation to work with the person on their more fundamental issues, whether it's drugs, mental health or alcohol. Because if they manage to stabilise those issues, then that is what is going to allow them to maintain accommodation for a period of time. So we're not getting into the detail of, how much your drug use has to reduce or anything like that, but we're saying, well, we want you to be in a position where it's well enough managed that you will be able to sort of settle and live a reasonably stable life, as judged by the fact that you're able to sustain accommodation. And we're doing the same thing for employment and training outcomes as well. So the idea is these might be really hard young people to work with, but they are 18 to 24. It ought to be possible over 3 years to get some of them into a job, or at least to get them some kind of entry level or higher qualification. And so we're paying for that as well. And again, in order to be able to achieve those outcomes, you're going to have to work with that person on whatever the problems are that led to their chaotic lifestyle thus far, because otherwise they won't be able to sustain a job for 6 months. So we're trying to use financial incentives on hard outcomes that we can measure properly to encourage work with really difficult people on more fundamental issues that we can't measure so easily. That's the idea. Okay, and we've just got, so we're about to announce this, I hope, £8 million single homelessness funding, where we're encouraging groups of authorities to do innovative work with a range of rough sleepers or other single homeless people to try and get them to turn their lives around in innovative ways and joined up ways across the local authorities. So I won't spend a lot of time on that. That's just an example of the StreetLink app, which you can Google or get from I forgot what it's called, Google Play, or whatever the app equivalent of that is. And lots of digital referrals. For July, there were 4,524 calls, quite a lot of self-referrals, quite a lot of digital referrals using mobile phones. So, just to say a little bit about the London Rough Sleeping Social Impact Bond. So this is about innovation, really. How might we move forward in the way that services are commissioned in the future? Now, in London, we're lucky on rough sleeping in that we have very good data. So we have something called a chain database, which records whenever a rough sleeper is seen out in the streets, records their name, their nationality, their age, their support needs, and so on. It records when they move into a hostel. It records how many times they're seen out on the streets over a period. And so we were able to select a group of people who had been rough sleeping on the streets at least 6 times in the previous 2 years, some of them 106 times, but 6 was the minimum. And to say, well, look, it looks as though the services, from what we can tell, are not doing very well with this particular group. Maybe that 70% of people only sleep rough once, but there's a minority of rough sleepers who actually have pretty entrenched problems. They don't tend to do well in hostels. They might well come back to the streets again and again and again. What can we do actually holistically to work with that person to help them sort their life out? And so we worked with the GLA to develop the social impact bond, where social investors basically take the risk of the service intervention, and the government pays for outcomes achieved. Now, those outcomes are intended to be spread across a range of areas to encourage work with the whole of that rough sleeping cohort. And this group of people actually accounted for 47% of rough sleeping in the previous year. So if you'd seen a rough sleeper in London in the year before the SIP started, 50-50 chance it would have been one of these people that would work with on the SIP. So what we paid for is reduced rough sleeping amongst the group according to chain database, but we also paid for people moving into and sustaining settled accommodation outside of the hostel system, because the hostel system is silted up, it doesn't work for everybody. We pay for reconnections abroad for foreign nationals who just don't have a chance of making it in this country because they don't have recourse to public funds. And we pay for increased employment outcomes, and we pay for reduced A&E admissions to the National Health Service. So we're trying to do something for the most chaotic people who are in and out of A&E all the time and stay on the streets, but we're also trying to pay for those who would be able over a 3-year period to move into a job. So it's intended to incentivise work with all of those, and with the risk being taken by social investors who tend to be charitable trusts who invest their endowment in something like a social impact bond rather than investing it on the stock market or putting it in building society. So it's a way that charitable trusts can actually enhance their ability to achieve social outcomes beyond their ability to make grants. Okay, so we know that single homelessness isn't just a housing issue. There's been lots of research on this. The causes of rough sleeping are complex, often driven by loss of employment, breakdown of personal relationships, increased housing costs, to some extent by reduced local authority services, but often for rough sleepers who stay on the streets, there are underlying long-term issues from their childhood and so on, which I'm sure you all know about. There's quite a big difference between support needs of UK rough sleepers, which tend to be higher, road sleepers, which tend to be low. It's the reason why foreign national road sleepers on the stable streets are partly because it's harder for them to get access to housing and employment. 60% of prisoners need help with housing on release. And if you look at the reoffending figures for people who were homeless before they went into custody and not homeless before they went into custody, then it's almost twice as many who were reoffended if they were homeless before they went into custody. So clearly achieving housing outcomes for people coming out of prison is a key thing. Okay, sort of keep the time. This is the last slide. So what are we thinking about looking forward? Well, we have an opportunity after the next election. We would expect there to be a spending review that perhaps lasts for 4 or 5 years. So that will be the time to be able to bid for funding to do something different in this area. And I think it's worth you bearing that in mind, in the sense that if you think it's something the government ought to be doing or supporting, or new ways to approach homelessness, then and in the end, a lot of the things the government ends up doing come from people like yourselves who try something out and find that it works. Do some research, like the Making Every Adult Matter research, or various things that have gone on, and then that's seeded, and then it ends up eventually, after a lot of struggle and lobbying and so on, and sometimes becoming government policy and getting rolled out, because we're always looking for what is the right thing to be doing. But anyway, what we are looking for really, what would be lovely is if you could prevent homelessness by addressing people's issues long before they became homeless on the streets. And if you're dealing with deprived people, then of course there's a lot of complex related issues that might lead to homelessness. One of the difficulties with that is how do you target your funding, because of 10 people you might target who might potentially become homeless according to the indicated that they might have, maybe only one of those would actually become homeless if you didn't intervene. So how do you spend your money effectively if you want to take that approach is a difficulty. But we do want to break the route into entrenched rough sleeping and look at those social problems that might be involved with homes more in the round, I think. And commissioning groups and health service funding and other funding abilities all may well play a role in being joined up to support those if we can swing it. We've got quite a long history of trying to do things like the Homelessness Change programme that encourage better hostel provision that will help people to move into employment and independence. There's quite a push to do something on housing first. Quite a lot of international research says housing first actually produces better outcomes for homeless people than putting them into a hostel or supported housing and then moving towards independence. Quite often if you put them into the accommodation and provide whatever support is needed in the beginning, and that can be better, but that's not the system we have here. We have a hostel and supported housing system, so maybe there needs to be some kind of transition away from that, but how could that be achieved in the most effective way? We want to harness the voluntary sector's expertise and ability to innovate, and some of these planning by results things I've been talking about are trying to do just that, trying to give organisations who might have the best idea how to work with an individual over a long period in a holistic way, the freedom to be able to do so. So although there's a financial risk that's being transferred from government, it is intended that by not specifying exactly how you would work with somebody, that you do have that opportunity to do what is needed for them, with hopefully social investors taking the risk rather than charitable organisations. But it does mean that you have to focus a lot more on what outcomes you think you can actually achieve for people with the services that you provide, and I think that is a real challenge for the voluntary sector going forward. So we're looking at plans by results and social investment, and clearly we want to do something that gives us more value for money, and potentially gives local authorities more value for money, given that there is generally less money to go around. So I think that's possibly a direction of travel. So that's all I can say. Thank you very much.
Tim, thank you.